God told Samuel, you looking at the house. And brother man do live in a mansion now, but you can't see, Sam, what I can see. And what I see on the inside, what I see when I look at Eliab's heart is a monster with a big ego and a small mind. No, Samuel, the one you're looking at is not the one I have chosen for myself. Jesse had 7 of his sons. Look at verse 10, 1 Samuel 16. He had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and the Lord did not choose any one of the 7. Verse 11, chapter 16, Samuel said to Jesse, are all your sons here? Jesse said, well, there is one more, but David was overlooked by people he loved. Jesse said, there is the younger son, the teenager, tending sheep, but he just keeps the sheep. David was overlooked by his own daddy, a person who called himself loving David. He believed in him enough to trust the sheep into his care, but he did not believe he could possibly be the one who be chosen by or anointed by God. David was overlooked by the people who were the closest to him. David was defined as unworthy by the very man who gave him life. Samuel said, verse 11, send and bring him, for we will not sit down to eat until all of your sons are here. And when David came into the room, look at verse 12. All of this is a prelude to chapter 17. Your adolescence is a prelude to your adulthood. If you are a teenager, turn to the person sitting next to you and tell them, you just looking at a prelude. Turn on the other side and say, all you can see is a preview of what God is getting ready to do. Throw your head back, everybody, throw your head back and say, we ain't got to the main attraction yet. We are just in the preview. I was taking Jamila earlier this year when it first came out to see Deja Vu with Denzel Washington. And we were running a little late. I think we had stopped to eat over at St. Rest, and the dinner took a little longer than I thought it would. I was upset because we were late. We were on 87th Street rushing, trying to get to 87th Street Chatham movie. The time in the paper said 7. The time when you dialed for the movie said 7. The time on the marquee said 7. And here we were pulling up at 5 after 7. And I was all antsy when Jamila said, relax, Daddy. They just showing the previews. The main attraction has not started. Adolescence is a prelude to a preview of adulthood. Turn back to your neighbor if you're a teenager and say, I told you. I'm just a preview of what God's getting ready to do. Verse 12, chapter 16 is just a preview of chapter 17. In verse 12, the Lord says to Samuel, rise. When David came into the room, rise and anoint him, for this is the one I have chosen. Look what this text teaches me. Adolescence, look what the text teaches me. Adolescents and a whole lot of adults who ain't learned this lesson. Number one, your identity is given by God. David's father may have defined him as less than important. This is the youngest boy. There's a young one, Bud, the teenager, Bud. He just keeps the sheep. David's father may have defined him as less than important. And right before we started reading in today's text in chapter 17, verse 28, God gives you a glimpse. Chapter 17, verse 28. Look at it. God gives you a glimpse of what God could see when God looked at Eliab's heart. Jealousy, egocentricity, arrogance, and a superiority complex. Eliab defined David as less than nice. He called David presumptuous, and he called David a person with an evil heart. Now, in the psychology of religion, my colleagues in that discipline would stop right here and preach a whole series of sermons as to how we project onto others the problems that are our own problems and are deeply rooted in our personalities. We accuse other folk of thinking a certain way because that's how we think. We accuse other folk of doing certain things either because that's what we are doing or because we know that if we were given the chance That is exactly what we would be doing. Remember that the next time you hear somebody gossiping all up under somebody's dress and in their clothes, folks speculating and projecting onto others what it is that they've been guilty of doing themselves. Eliab projects onto David the very qualities that God could see all along beneath his veneer of a buffed body. Remember also what I told my children about bodies. A whole lot of people you meet in life will have bodies by Fisher, but minds by Mattel. They are game boys in the flesh because all they got is game on their mind. Eliab had a fine body, but Eliab had a foul spirit. Eliab was presumptuous. Eliab was the one with the evil heart. But he projected his mess onto David, and he also misdefined David. But the text teaches us that David's identity was not proscribed by his daddy, nor circumscribed by his brother. David's identity was given to him by God. Then number two, closely related to it, David's worth was given by God. That's the verse I told you to put a pin in a moment ago because we were coming back to it. David's worth was not tied up in the low estimate his dad had of him. David's worth was given by God. Look what God said. I have provided for myself a king among Jesse's sons. And please notice, if you will, God's assignment for David and God's assessment of David were in place even before David knew it. God had assigned worth to David long before David knew anything about it. Young people, God has an assessment of you that has nothing to do with baby fat, Sean John, FUBU, your popularity, or your peers. God has an assignment for you that you don't even know about yet, and God has assigned worth to you that you don't even realize yet. Turn back to your neighbor and tell your neighbor, I told you. We ain't even got to the main attraction yet. Turn on the other side and say, I am just a preview of what God is getting ready to do. God's assignment for David and God's assessment of David were in place long before David knew anything about either one of them. David's worth was given by God. His worth was not tied up in the low estimate his daddy had of him, and his worth was not tied into the low expectation that his brother had for him. His worth was determined by God, who told Samuel, you will anoint the one I have chosen. Quick footnote. Somebody needs to hear this quick footnote. Turn to your neighbor and say footnote. When God chooses you, this is too important for me to say it by myself, so I want you to say it along with me. Turn to your neighbor and tell your neighbor, when God chooses you, it cancels out whoever and whatever tries to abuse you. David's identity was given by God. David's worth was assigned by God.